All right. I'm going to be teaching how to scientifically deduce moral laws and stuff, and say that it's also just as objective as physical sciences and stuff. And I have a method of proving it. And then I also have scriptures and stuff. So the thing that ticked me off one time is I was in class and my teacher was telling me that, well, first of all, they always got that thing where morality is relative and all that nonsense and stuff. And then this teacher was telling me that scientific study was subjective. It doesn't make any sense. So I'm going to start off explaining science, what it actually is, and then explain how that goes into a lot of deeper stuff. And I think I can develop a method. And here's my little theory as to what this method goes to. If you know who Carl Jung is, in my beliefs, I think Carl Jung is the first metaphysical mathematician. And when I say metaphysics, I mean physics and laws concerning the internal conscious reality. And so I'm not exactly sure what metaphysics means, but that's kind of what people mean when they say that. And so I think metaphysics mathematics makes sense. But in order to get there, in order to study scientifically and objectively the moral subjective reality, which I will show you how to do, I will, even if it sounds crazy, we have to understand what the actual scientific method is. So to get rid of that subjective nonsense that they were teaching me in my university level class, you think they'd be smarter than that by now, but they were telling me basically that everything's subjective, everything's biased or whatever, nothing's real, blah, blah, blah. So people ask themselves that question, of course, way before us. They're like, okay, we all have our own biases, our own experiences. How can we study something so that we may completely be certain that it's a real, objective, outside of our bias? And what they came up with was the scientific method. Now, the first guy who really grilled into this idea was René Descartes, because he asked himself this question. He was like, okay, I'm subject to biases and I'm subject even to hallucinations in my own mind. And so how can I be certain that something is physically real and meaningful, right? So that's what his meditations were. Now, in his meditations, he deduced, first of all, that the most fundamental axiom to existence, which is axiom means truth, a presumed truth, self-evident, is that we are conscious. That's the only thing you can be completely, absolutely certain of that isn't a lie, really. That's the axiom of everything. The uncaused cause at the beginning of the universe, even that you are conscious, the only thing you can be completely certain of. You can say that there's things you're experiencing, and those things potentially can be hallucinations. They might not be real, but you can at least say that there's a thing which is experiencing. You could say even your thoughts are lies, but you can not say that there's not a thing thinking those thoughts. So that's where the famous line comes from, is René Descartes' deductions, in which he says the famous line comes from. I don't think he actually says it, but it says, "I think, therefore I am," because these certain conscious things exist. Then Descartes goes on to deduce, he actually says that God then exists from his deductions, and he also deduces physics to a degree. So he's the real main founder of physics. If you've seen the XY coordinates, if you've attended middle school or elementary math, potentially, the XY coordinate system, it's actually called the Cartesian plane. And so he's the guy. Cartesian, named after René Descartes, who founded physics and stuff. His main deductions included God's existence, and it included the idea of physics, how to identify a physical world outside of main biases and things. Who built upon it was Isaac Newton, of which I have a quote on currently. This is from Isaac Newton's first law of physics, of relativity. And so yeah, that's René Descartes. If you really want to have a pure deduction answering every hardest possible idea of how to get past the subjective reality and enter into the physical reality and what you can be certain of and to what degree, René Descartes will cover that to a T in his meditations. You can just Google that. It's a PDF if you want. But to simplify, I'll tell you straight up how to obviously study something objectively, how the scientific method is formed, and it's actually extremely simple. First off, it's just simply observation. That's what it is, observation. It's looking at what happens. So this is how you get past bias, because you can theorize, you can feel something, you can think whatever, think a thought about here or there, whatever. But at the end of the day, whatever happens is what's true. You can make a prediction is like, okay, I think the sun's not gonna rise tomorrow. And then you could argue with someone who says, no, well, I think the sun is gonna rise tomorrow. And then you guys can argue all night. But eventually the truth ends up being, well, did the sun rise? And if it did, that's your observation and that's your scientific basis. And so that's what science is. And the other part of it is it's actually naming things. It is naming specific things which are sort of subtle. And that point of naming things is actually is fascinating because it's so simple, but it's like it's not there unless you name it. Okay, let me say what I mean. An object at rest stays at rest, and an object in motion stays in motion with the same speed in the same direction unless acted upon by an unbalanced force. Okay, that's a very specific observation about things that exist. And this is the scientific principle, something that can be tested, observed, and not gone against. And so that's why it's a scientifically observed principle. It's something that's tested. It happens, whether you argue away or not. It's just how it is. An object is at rest unless it's acted upon. Obviously, put a force to it, it moves. That's just a basic observation of reality. But it is very distinct because it goes over a subtlety, for example. If I push this marker, right, if I push it, it stops. Like, even though I'm not pushing back on it, it stops. And so you might say, well, actually, objects tend to stop. But the brilliance of Newton's thing here is he says, okay, but why do they tend to stop? And then he figures out why. And then, so you end up with physics, for example. And he makes this statement that, well, anything has to have some sort of force. So he names force, for example. That's something that's named. Force is something that's very complicated because it's also something that's specifically named. So just let me show you how complicated this gets. Because it's something completely intuitive, basic observation. But what's brilliant about the scientific principle is it's naming everything specifically which is occurring. Every specific part which is occurring. So the first specific part that's occurring is this is a thing, so it has mass, right? Mass is a name for just stuff. So that's the importance of mass, why it's a scientific unit. And acceleration is the speeding up of something. That's another name. And force is identified as moving some sort of mass, so speeding it up. So applying and transferring energy is how he identified force, and he identified it in a measurable way, measurable by acceleration and mass. So this is a naming thing. This is very related to naming and pure observation. And this is the basis of science. It's not a complicated study where you have to write a hypothesis and then like do certain mathematics and then whatever. I mean, that's obviously a part of it, but this basic principle of how do you get past all bias, observation, and naming. And the naming part is fascinating for a couple of reasons we'll get to later in a second, but that's essentially what this is, right? And then so he names the force, and then so he figures out what that is, and he's like, okay, well, mass and acceleration, well, then it stays at a certain speed, so now it's going to keep moving. So that moves it up to a different velocity. So he's naming motion. He's naming what motion is. And he's saying, like, unless it's acted upon, it's not going to stop. Then he, by that, is able to figure out what friction is, rubbing up against stuff. So if I apply force here, then for it to stop moving, there's also a force here. So all of that specific in naming allows you to identify all these different things. And eventually, this is how you get usefulness out of science. Okay, so how does naming things specifically result in you having a laptop, for example? Well, how does it result in rockets, for example? And then one basic thing is projectile motion. And so if we pick up from Descartes, our Cartesian plane, in which for very complicated reasons, he somehow deduced this, which this is also the naming of things. This is the naming of spatial. So he named this direction, he named this direction, he named it X and Y, and he gave it units of measurement, like you give units of measurement. That's naming of distances. All of this is naming. And the usefulness of naming is then you can predict things. And if you can predict things, you can build things, you can make them useful. So that's also another part of science, is it's oriented on purpose. Because science isn't just finding new things. One of the things that's corrupted universities and made them love to say everything's subjective, for example, is it's like science is purely just finding new things. I actually asked my teacher one time, I asked, why do you think we do science, for example? And she said, it's because we can discover things that are new. No, it's not to do that. It's so that you can discover new things which are useful, or you can use things you know to accomplish some sort of purpose. That's what engineering is. And so science is actually based on purpose, because it's based on naming things for the purpose to benefit people. To benefit people, to make a pharmaceutical drugs to cure ailments, to make cars to travel faster. It's to serve human things. And it's based on the faith that, first of all, because it's based on discovery, it's based on the faith that there's something outside of me, something that's real, something I don't know, something that's meaningful and useful outside of me. And if I discover it, you have a faith in it will be something that benefits me, and it is something good, and it justifies, for example, the fact that life is worth something, right? Because why should I go and discover something? Well, if I go and discover something, well, then I will get to paradise. So that's the idea of having faith in life and love and the benefit of humanity, which is God, having faith in God to deliver you to the paradise, the promised land, the land promised to you if you keep the covenant. And so that's what this scientific faith is there's something outside of me in which I could discover, which will benefit me and lead me to a promised land, and that's a faith on it's worth it. Because you could say, okay, why should you do science at all? Maybe it's not worth living, and you don't know that. But science is about discovering things you don't know. And in order to do that, you trust that it's worth it. So that's faith, is science is oriented in that way. And then it's the process of naming. So just to see how this process of naming is extremely useful, it's the whole process of solving a mathematic problem is naming all the things with all the previous named principles, and then you can make some sort of extraordinarily specific prediction. And then so let's say someone threw a ball. This is our XY coordinates to represent the throwing of a ball. So you apply some force this direction, and then it has a trajectory like this. And then we want to ask, okay, how far is that ball going to go? And then we have triangles. So we named a triangle. Then we named different angles. We named a couple of functions which come from the moving of triangles. And we came up with, how to deduce the different, so we have an angle here, how to deduce the different levels of force. This is how you find this force, that force. Then we figured out that each component of force works on its own, horizontal and vertical. So this is the horizontal force right here. Then from that process, we also figured out sort of how position changes, time, and then you could figure out based on that force the velocity and how that time goes and all those sorts of things, and eventually figure out this distance here. Distance equals some amount of meters. And so just that process of naming goes throughout all the calculations and all those sorts of things. So yeah, this is essentially what his laws are. An object stays at rest in motion. It's naming a phenomenon which occurs, and this naming goes all the way to the bottom. It's figuring things out. This is a reference to what reality is, because I was saying earlier is like at the end of the day, you have to recognize something which occurs, right? And that's the end of the story. That's what's real and that's what's true. God introduces himself to Moses and he says, I am that I am. He's essentially saying, he's like if you've ever heard the phrase like, it is what it is, that's a true proverb, because that's basically saying like, what it is what it is. God is saying he is the thing, he is the I am. He's also saying he's spirit, because I am. It's also in line with Descartes' quote, I think, therefore I am, the singular axiom of observation of the self-evident thing that spirit exists within you. God is saying he is that axiom. He is that spirit. He's also identifying himself as reality itself and truth itself, because he's saying he is observation. He is what occurs whether you argue it away or not. I am that I am. And this is his name that he gives for himself. And so it's interesting because we just discussed things, the process of understanding things is generally naming. For God, if you want to name God, which is everything, he's like, God is saying, okay, I'm everything that is true, but I'm not everything that's a lie. So he's everything in reality, but not the stuff that's a lie. And then so the stuff you say that's a lie, or you think it lies and stuff like that, that's not God. And then God is identifying, he says, that I am, and those sorts of things. Is a actual reference to the actual quotes in which God gives justification for why his statutes are true. And it actually shows that it's in line specifically with the scientific process of observation. The process of observation is essentially what occurs can be generalized to occur in the future. And so, for example, as we had Newton's law earlier, which is that if you push an object and it stays in motion, we could say that because that observation occurs and it occurs every time we do it, and every time we do it, it doesn't get broken, that we could predict and generalize that that's probably a phenomenon of reality which is going to occur in the future. And so, okay, well, how do I know that if I drop this, it's going to go down? Well, because every time I dropped it before, it went down. And so that's a generalization of, because this always occurred rightly in the past, because it always occurred in the past, then it's going to continue to occur in the future. This is actually the justification that God gives throughout Leviticus for why his statutes should be followed and why what he says is true. You shall do no unrighteousness in judgment, in meat yard, in weight, or in measure, just balances, just weights, a just ephah, and a just hin shall ye have. I am the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt. Therefore shall ye observe all my statutes and all my judgments and do them. I am the Lord. God is saying essentially, he's like, okay, well, you're suffering and you want to not be enslaved and you want things to not suck. Well, remember that all the stuff I taught you is what brought you out of Egypt. And so therefore, what I'm saying is true. And so he's asking the question is essentially, how do you know following these laws is going to help you? Well, because every time in the past when you followed them, it did help you. And so he says, I brought you out of Egypt, therefore you shall observe my statutes. And that same sort of observation is the exact same generalization made even to the scientific processes which developed the technological abilities that we currently have to do all sorts of miracles. And so that's the justification of faith. And then so I'm just going to show a couple things. I covered physics, how physics is a process of naming things as it relates to the different predictions. I'm going to just show some psychological and psychiatric things and clear up this confusion, because this is something that really annoys me. about big pharma and stuff like that. And I just want to actually show how this actually relates to the scientific process and why it's useful. So the diagnosing of a psychological phenomenon like depression, for example, or diagnosing of like ADHD, these are just names. That's what science is. It's naming things. These are names of patterns of behavior, narcissism as well. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there's something chemically wrong with your brain. It just means that there's something wrong with your behavior. And that behavior, by the way, is on a moral basis itself. Because if there's something wrong with your behavior, you're making a moral judgment. And so these disorders don't have any meaning unless we have a sort of moral basis to go off of. Because otherwise they're not disorders, they're just things. And so that's why one of the results of the secularization of universities is that people and teachers and stuff will start saying that disorders and things are just like not real, and disabilities are made up by the patriarchy and norms because there's no morality or whatever. But again, morality is based on what occurs on reality and observations, and those observations are obviously real because our identity of reality is the most fit one, which is things that happen, which is God. And you can generalize what's a disability based on that. So the reason depression is a disability, for example, is because if you have depression, then you might not function properly. You won't eat. You won't go and do things. You won't work. And so you need to do those things to live. And our faith in the sciences and in God is that life is worth it and good. So it's a faith and judgment. And then that is depression is therefore a disorder. ADHD is you can't focus, you can't accomplish a certain task, which is useful. Therefore, ADHD is a disorder. Narcissism is you're obsessed with yourself, you can't think of others. Therefore, it's a disorder because it's not loving. So these are moral-based things. They're not necessarily chemical imbalances. Psychiatric drugs cover up some of the symptoms, but they don't necessarily solve them a lot of the time. And these disorders are mostly just caused by issues in how you do your life, for example. And so if you sin a lot and you lead a terrible life, then you're going to develop behaviors which aren't good. Like I think you might, this isn't necessarily labeled as a disorder, but it's like, I guess, a thing you can get treatment for. Like alcoholism is obviously something done by behavior, and you might be led there to that sort of addiction by other things gone wrong in your life, perhaps things you didn't do. But even then, even though bad stuff happens to you in your life, it's still a moral issue that you are stuck in alcoholism, which is technically your fault. Not to be too harsh on that, but it's the technical definition of what's going on in how sin works. And then the same is to be said with this, is like, it's technically your fault, because it's like, if you have a depression, it's sort of giving up. It's like, okay, everything sucks, and then I'm just going to give up. There's no hope for me. And that's what causes depression is lack of hope. And so that's part of why faith cures you, because it's like hope that things are going to get better. Actually, I think I don't know where the statistic comes from, but I think the statistic is, you could look it up yourself, that religion is actually the main cure for depression specifically, like religious conversion. And that makes sense because it gives you a structure and a hope. And those are the things which are going to lift you out of just, things sucking, for example. So these are just names of things which disable you from the moral order, and things which they're essentially names for patterns of behavior. Depression is like, okay, lack of motivation, lack of movement, lack of all those sorts of things. ADHD is, you could go in the DSM. The DSM is a book which just lists out the different characteristics, naming different behaviors, and then lumping it under one name of disorder. This disorder is based on the moral order. It's based on observations and behavioral patterns, which are not necessarily linked to just chemical imbalances. Also considering the fact that the main axiom of life and the precedent for existence is consciousness, it's not necessarily proper to say that the cure to these sort of disorders is simply a psychiatric cure, but rather it's a more change of your internal will and spirit to be oriented towards God and the actual statutes which lead you out of the wilderness to the promised land and such. And so these things are names, and this goes throughout the whole process. It goes through chemistry, the naming of atoms, naming of proteins. All of these things are just names. And so just because you're named with a certain behavior or disorder, that just means that you're rough, and you're rough in a certain specific way. You're rough because you can't pay attention. You're rough because you have depression. ADHD is actually something that's increasing, which is evidence that these disorders are formed by behavioral things. They're also increased in people who use media. And so if you're watching TikTok and you're in a world that's very fast like this, which is as technology progresses, it's also more prevalent in developed countries, which people at university will say it's because we do more studies here or whatever, but doesn't really follow. I mean, yeah, but the sample sizes are not based on how much people. Okay, anyways, I'm pretty sure it's just because more developed countries have more technology and things, and that reduces your attention span. And so ADHD has evidence that it's something linked to behavioral things. Depression is linked to motivation. Narcissism is actually something that's increasing as well. And I think that's also related to social media. So these are behavioral things essentially, and they're not condemnations that there's something incurably wrong with you and you need to take a drug or something. This is the thing of naming things that I've been talking about forever. This is the instruction that God gave to Adam. It's actually something that's so fundamental. It is what you were always doing. Like when you calendar your literal day, when you're figuring out how your day is gonna go, you're naming events which are gonna occur in time, you're naming places, you're naming people. What's the first thing you ask someone? It's what's their name? It's what do I call you? How? So your first ability to understand someone's existence starts with, what do I call you? Now the Lord God had formed out of the ground all the wild animals and all the birds in the sky. He brought them to a man to see what he would name them. And whatever the man called each living creature, that was its name. So literally the duty given by God to Adam, the first main thing is to name things. And so that's the process of understanding and discovery. Whoops. So, the freak. My bad. Anyways, so to get very specific, now we have to figure out mathematics and how this is related to naming, because this is actually, mathematics is the most intensive naming process of all the sciences. In fact, this is why mathematics is so fundamental to everything. It's literally the people figured out a process of naming. The equal sign is the assignment of definition. This is saying this means this, right? 0 is equal to 0. 0 means 0. When you get into algebra, this equal sign becomes extremely important, because it's okay, this number, this variable right here, right, this x, is something. What is it? And then if you know how algebra works, you do this and you figure out x equals 2. Okay, so your literal goal was to name the variable, to figure out what it was, and that is done by this equal sign here, the assignment of definition. And so x is equal to 2. And that is the whole process of mathematics, is rearranging equations so that you can find the names for different variables. That is literally the whole process of mathematics. And if you get into really stupid stuff, like let me try to remember how this goes. I think it's like 2 pi. If you're doing really stupid stuff, you do names even just by, you name things based off names. So this right here is, this right here is like rotational or angular velocity. This right here is the force constant of a spring. This is mass. Then if you want to combine them together through different equations to find the period of harmonic oscillation, you multiply it by 2 pi, or yes, I think it's multiplying by 2 pi. Yes, you multiply it by 2 pi to sort of extend this angular velocity throughout the whole circle to find out the whole time it takes to go around that circle, and then you find the amount of oscillation a pendulum would have, for example. So if you have like a pendulum swinging back and forth, that is these equations. That's how physics is. Physics gets ridiculous, and it's just naming things all based off names of things. And so that's how mathematics goes, and it goes really deep like that. And it's just that over and over again. Linear algebra, for example, is like how do you find these 3 variables, and then there's a whole method of, okay, how do you find the names of these variables? Math problems you're not given new information in math problems. You're given all the information, and then you're given the task, name these things now figure out what they are, and then it's the process of figuring out how to define them. And then those definitions are useful, for example, for a bunch of unknown stuff that you have, to find out, for example, the trajectory of things, how things move, how things go together. And all these rules in which we have, like this rule, are based on observation, based on the faith that observation is worth it. So a lot of building blocks, which originally come from the reality of God's I am that I am, and why should we trust that, and because let us out of Egypt and all those things, and the process of naming which he gave us. So it gives you all these all these things. And then so this is a matrices, by the way, if you care at all about that, is you would solve this problem by developing a matrices if you have what they're equal to. Then you fill that out in whole process, and then you figure out what all the variables are. So that's mathematics, for example. Now, all of that to say is, why is there a certain discrimination, for example, of the physical and the moral? Like, why does this scientific process so easy to disregard as it relates to moral and subjective realities and stuff? What makes the internal reality even subjective, for example? Why do universities teach classes nothing on moral and plenty on physics and sciences and stuff like that? Well, first of all, it's obviously because morals aren't something that are, if you figure them out, if you figure out the answer to that, that's not necessarily enough for someone to be a moral person. If they have the answer to something, they'll just not want to do it. And then so over time, even in complex institutions, that'll just fan away. But the other part is, you can't really measure moral things, and it's a very difficult thing to measure. It's also a very vague identification. But why? So the first thing you want to know is what measurement is. Measurement is, again, a naming. It's necessarily arbitrary. but they're only named so that we can have a useful identification of distances. This, like the distance of 1 inch, 1 meter, there's no reason it has to be that specific amount of space. That specific amount of space doesn't mean anything on its own, and it's completely arbitrary. It's just like it could be this long, this long, this long. It's just a naming of a unit of space so that we can use it, and that's what a meter is. So measurement is 1 meter. But here's the thing about measurement. The reason we're able to name things is because give a universal name to things is because we all experience them. So physical tables, for example, like this is a physical object right here. I'm able to name the distances because we all can see the distance. And then I could say, okay, we are all going to agree that this specific distance is 1 meter. The issue is there's internal things. So the difference between internal things, the specific difference is that internal things like emotions, like, I don't know, love, like sad, pain, happy, whatever those things mean, are, first of all, vague within themselves because they sort of mean everything different to each other. This is why people get so caught up in that moral thing, is because they sort of mean different things to each other. The fact that we are able to discuss them and generally know what we're talking about is actually proof that they are objective phenomena, because we're both experiencing the same type of reality. And so the reason we're able to talk about what love feels like and what it is means we are experiencing the same sort of feeling, and there's an objective nature to the internal realities which are occurring, which are emotions. So that, first of all, is interesting. In the same way, we are able to objectively identify measurement distances and objectively identify things and show proofs that those work out by the development of technology. For these, we can't really measure them because we can't all see them. Whereas in the physical world, we might be able to collectively agree, okay, this is 1 meter, this is a certain amount of distance. We can't look into each other's heads and say an arbitrary length, like, okay, I see you're feeling this emotion. We're all seeing this certain emotion. Let's make an arbitrary mark here and say that's 1 meter of love right there you're experiencing. And then look at the person next to him. It's like, okay, well, we have a measurement here. This person is experiencing this much more, this less. Okay, you're experiencing this much love. This is like 0.5 meters of love. You can't really make measurements of that because we can't see them and add arbitrary names and do the process of naming extremely specifically down the line really long, like we can with mathematics for the physical world. And then so that's why the internal moral emotions are. And then so what exactly does it mean to name the metaphysical, the internal, the subjective, and stuff like that? Well, it's done with words. So whereas in physics we would have symbols and specific numbers as measurements, we actually have that same sort of thing going on with the internal, which are words. And again, the fact that we understand these words means that they have some sort of objective meaning. It's a proof of that. And these words are how we identify arbitrary measurements. So the naming of emotions is the same process of the mathematics and physics which occurs, but it is not as precise because it can't be extremely specific because we can't all observe numerical quantitative values. But we are still identifying something which is equally real. So this is important because this is the basis of morals. Now, in a more general sense, obviously you can deduce morals in the fact that, okay, I do some things and there's some consequences to my actions which cause physical things around me to fall apart. Like, I didn't clean my room's messy, and you could say that's immoral to a degree. But the hyper-specific realization of why does it matter that something is immoral is, because it makes me suffer. Or why is something good? Oh, because it makes me happy. These are the basis of moral things, and how you identify certain moral actions. And so if someone does an action which causes pain, we are identifying some vague, arbitrary emotion which has some objective precedence, because everybody experiences it, so it's real and it's experienced by everybody. We can't quantify it, but we are identifying some vague amount of something happening, and the action causing pain, we label, again, the action of labeling as bad. And that's useful because we don't want bad things. That's actually one of the self-evident things. Again, consciousness is the axiom. It's self-evident. It is the M that is, I am that I am. It is just simply there. So we don't know why bad things feel bad. We don't know what it means that things feel bad. We just know that they're bad. We just experience the emotions. We experience all that stuff, and we just say, okay, I don't want that because that's not good. You aren't really in control of what you feel. You just feel it. You're just in control of like what you do. You're not in control of what you feel, for example. And so actions and circumstances generally are universal on how they cause you to feel. And your response to them is also universal on how it causes you to feel and others around you to feel. And so we are able to make general objective claims that there is some sort of emotions that we all share, and the world being composed of the same physical elements means that the same sorts of actions cause the same sorts of emotions, which mean there are a realm of actions which we can label as bad, because there's a realm of actions and emotions which go with those that are bad. And you could do the same for good. Good in action causes, let's say it causes love. So those are labels. And then this is identified as morals. And then that goes obviously very complicated to all sorts of realms. And then so we could show just a more basic chain here. It's like, I strike you, so I hit you. That causes pain. Therefore, striking is a bad thing. So there we go. We just identified one moral thing. We named it. We figured out. We did a scientific process aligned with the historic sciences, which developed technologies in physics. We conducted that process and therefore just named hitting somebody as bad based on observation and naming. On the same level of mathematics, by the means of words. Strike, pain, bad. Now, this goes into a little bit of what God is, again, because he's reality. So there's something that Einstein said, in which, or he didn't directly say, but it was his goal. A lot of scientists sort of have this goal. It's the thing in quantum physics is people want the equation. They want the equation which describes the world. Now, the reason I'm sure these people in quantum physics are at a halt, and there's actually some quantum physicists which would agree, because they believe that consciousness is more precedent to reality. This is something which is in those fields going on, which is debated. And the person who invented, what did he invent? He invented something very important. And so he has credibility. Actually thinks, I forgot what he invented, it was something really important. That consciousness preceded reality as well. He thinks that consciousness constructs the physical world, as quantum physics is based on potential, and that classical physics emerges from it. These people have the goal in mind to identify the equation which encompasses all of reality. The equation is a definition. It's an assignment of definition. It's the equal sign. It's figuring out which numbers and symbols describe everything. The thing they are missing is that words are descriptions of the internal reality, which is just as, if not more, important to description of reality itself. Now, the connection of reality to the internal reality to the physical the playing out of the most meaningful life, was the representation of Christ on the cross, suffering and dying. It was the connection of God and spirit to the physical. The Word became flesh. And it's described as the Word because the Word is the equation, because the words are the identification of everything. So the Word, which identifies everything, is the truest reality, the most supreme reality. And so the Word becoming flesh is the connection between reality to the divine. And that is why in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not one thing made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in the darkness, and the dark comprehended it not. Then it says later that the Word became flesh and walked among us. And that's the description of Christ as the Word. So if you follow a chain of definitions, theoretically you would be able to figure out a mathematical precise description of things by words. Now, the difference right now that we currently have is that we aren't able to experience other people's realities. That's the difference between the level of physics we have in mathematics and the level of specificness that we have for moral ideas. Is that way we haven't experienced it. The thing about Christ, what is so interesting is it's like, okay, how do you have somebody who would understand things and be able to measure them to the finest degree? And it means you have somebody who experienced all the pain and suffering of everybody else. How would you have someone who knows how to address it properly? And you have someone who experienced all the pain and suffering of everyone else. And that's the story of Christ, is that he is the connection, the Word, the thing that experienced all your sins on the cross. And because he has that relation of experience of everything, he's able to make the fine degree measurements that we make with physics through pure observation on the moral level and the consciousness level. If we had a literature, like we do the scientific literature is the gathering of data and putting it into one big pile and saying, here's all the information we have, figure something out from it. If we were able to do that with moral things, which we currently aren't, it would essentially be telepathy. It would be the telepathic communication of, I'm going to experience all your realities in my mind, and with this compilation of the extreme literature, form conclusions based on that. And that is the idea of deducing the equation, the missing portion, which is the Word, which is Christ and all that. So, yeah, that's how you do metaphysical mathematics. It would essentially be finding out the same way with the equal sign. This is incredibly important. It's the assignment of definition. Using this equal sign and then taking it to some sort of words. Like, say you find such and such a word, and then this word means this word and this word and this word. And then you say, okay, this word is important. Then we have, well, let me sign these colors. This is the process we do in mathematics, and I'm expressing with some sort of words. And then this word means these words, these words, these words, right? So then you have an equation where it's like, okay, now this word means both the red and the blue word. And these words mean all these other ones. So this big word means these two, which means all of this. And then so you keep redefining things until you find a word which describes everything. And that's what you do with mathematics, is you keep redefining things to get closer to the truth, to find an equation which defines all the other equations, which defines the physical world and describes absolutely everything. And That process is what the process of mathematics is finding a more general solution, a solution which describes abstractly more things. And so if you start as a word with like little words like table, fun, and you figure out like, okay, what do these mean? What does this mean? What does this mean? What does this mean? You find a bunch of equal signs. Eventually you get to the big word, which is the word. So that's what it's calling itself, is the word. The description of reality itself is the story of Christ, essentially, which is how it formed the world. So, yeah, that's metaphysical mathematics.